Because, of course, this is an Easter unlike any other that I've ever known, and I'm sure you have felt the same way. This seems to be an Easter unlike any we've ever known before, at least in our lifetimes. So that had me thinking about time and events in the context of Easter. Time has a way of marching indifferently over our dearly held beliefs, our opinions, our loves. No matter the holiday, the desire, the ideology, or political moment, time and the indiscriminate nature of things virtually guarantee the end of one thing or another. Nothing is immune to the effect of time and change. Ideas great and small, miracles, moments of awe and wonder, religious experience, can all fade in the march of time. We find these things occurring. This is not unfamiliar to us. All fall to the march of time except, of course, for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. No matter what event or what crisis appears to obscure this event, whether it's war or pestilence or plague, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead endures and persists and grows like a great mountain that fills the whole earth. And it shall ever be so. And so this had me thinking a little bit. Now, it's largely believed that the best date for the death of Christ, his crucifixion, which I think was first advanced by Sir Isaac Newton, was April 3rd, A.D. 33. April 3rd, A.D. 33. Now, it's interesting to consider what was happening at the time. At that time in the history of Israel, the coming of Messiah was expected to be something more of a political deliverer. Many thought that Jesus would be that sort of liberator as well, an emancipator in the same style as King David, to deliver the people from their Roman occupiers. A religious reformer who would restore Israel to her former glory. It's likely, for example, that Judas believed this. This is the role the Messiah would fulfill. And yet Jesus accomplished none of this. Jesus accomplished none of these things. And if it weren't for the resurrection, he would have been lost in history like 1,000 other religious zealots. And there were others. Many people don't know and they don't realize that there were other messianic figures in Jerusalem and in Israel, preceding and after Jesus. There were other religious movements and messianic and prophetic movements that occurred, that took place in the first century. One in particular I thought I would mention occurred during the Jewish-Roman War of AD 60 through 70, one named Simon Bar Giora. Many of the Jews regarded him as their true leader and something of a Messiah, a king. He garnered for himself something like 40,000 soldiers, donned the purple robe, and sat on the throne and reigned for several months. He even got the title at one point, Redemption of Zion, suggesting that they truly did imbue him with messianic hope. The redemption of Zion. Eventually, though, Simon Bar Giora was taken back to Rome. It's actually curious. They thought that they would tunnel their way out of the city, he and a band. And as they went down into an ancient tunnel with some stonemasons, they started to make their way out, and they found that it was too difficult. And weeks later, after the fall of Jerusalem, he emerged out of a hole. Sounds kind of familiar. He emerged out of a hole. And when they said, "Hey, who are you?" some of them recognized who he was. And before long, he was taken to Rome, and he was paraded as part of part of Titus's victory crusade. And at the end of the spectacle, he was given a typical Roman end. He was flogged and executed. Now, unless you're a history buff, with an interest in late first century Jewish zealotry, you'd probably never have heard of him. But stop and consider this for a moment. Jesus came and performed all of his miracles. He fed the 5,000. He healed lepers. He cast out demons. He did one miracle after another. And then he was crucified. And his disciples went throughout Jerusalem saying that they had seen him, that he was raised from the dead, that he appeared before them, that they showed him his nail prints and his side. And yet only 35 years later, a whole other generation of people had forgotten or ignored or dismissed Jesus of Nazareth and placed their hope in a totally new figure, this Simon Bar-Giora. It's a curious thing. When we think of the resurrection in these terms, we find that the resurrection of Jesus appears to be buried by current events. And if it were not for the resurrection story and the sincere faith of his followers, Jesus would have been buried forever by time and history. And we would not be talking about him at all. Had he not been resurrected, these and other historical interlocutors would have eclipsed him entirely. Certainly, for the followers of Simon Bar-Giora, Jesus, in spite of the resurrection and the testimonies of his disciples, had been dismissed as the Messiah and disregarded. And it's often like that today. What's the point of all this? Why bring up an obscure personality like this? As you can see, it's almost as if we're burying the resurrection story in history, and by doing so, it makes Jesus seem sort of less significant. But it is not. In fact, it demonstrates the point that the story cannot be buried by history, no matter what happens. This year, all of us can agree, it almost seems as if Easter is being buried and put in the tomb by this COVID-19 virus. Here we are celebrating the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, but most of us are not in our churches. We can't gather as we would like. The church should be filled to the brim, as it has been each of these years, right? Every year our church has been filled to the brim on Easter Sunday. And yet we also know that there will probably be no large family gatherings and no celebrations for many of us, no going to a restaurant to celebrate or out for ice cream. Instead, we're all staying home. It will be as if, for many, Easter never happened. And there are many who live, of course, as if Easter never happened. For some of us, it will seem as if winter and Lent have gone on forever and swallowed up this holiday. It's as if history marched right over the celebration of the resurrection. But the good news is that this is not so. The fact of the matter is that despite Simon Bar-Giora and his rebellion and his subsequent execution, Jesus had risen from the dead. And the Roman streets that witnessed Bar-Giora's execution would in decades be filled with Christians. And within 200 years, that entire city would be a Christian city. And the emperor would be a Christian emperor. And by the time Simon Bar-Giora is having his little time of conquest, there are already Roman soldiers and slaves bringing the gospel to the British Islands and to North Africa and to Iran and further parts of the world and all throughout Europe. Over the ensuing centuries, the story of the resurrection of God's true Messiah would spread throughout the world and conquer history itself. This is the mystery of the resurrection and of the gospel. We learn this in the book of Daniel about a stone that will grow and become a great mountain and fill all the earth. He shares the dream that the king has and says, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut without human hands, which struck the image at its feet of iron and clay and broke it into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, and the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff in the summer threshing floors." What an image. "And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all of these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." Our Easter story is not merely about some religious figure or a zealot or a teacher of wonderful and kind things. It is the most confident story about a kingdom inaugurated at the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a kingdom which has struck the kingdoms of the world and is consuming them from then till now, as it works its way through them all like yeast, until the whole world is filled with the power of the resurrection. We find the gospel of the resurrection planted in this world, amidst the swells of history and the wrecks of time. As the hymn says, "In the cross of Christ I glory. In the cross of Christ I glory, towering over the wrecks of time. All the light of sacred story gathers around its head sublime. Christ is risen from the dead, but the world expects a Messiah after the likeness of Simon Bar-Giora, not of Jesus Christ. Our expectation, the expectation of the world, is for God to show himself and make the world nice for us, here and now, to vanquish our enemies and to give peace in our land. The sword is an easier path, though, than sainthood. We want a gospel and a Christ that would have interrupted time forever, that would have stopped the march of time and left such a mark that no other history could ever be written. But this is not the way the story goes, and this is not the salvation that was to come. God saved the world in its own domain of time. And for that reason, time and experience and distraction and illusion all continue. And all threaten to bury the momentous event of Jesus Christ being raised from the dead. As the Apostle Paul puts it in the book of Hebrews, now in putting everything in subjection under him, he left nothing that was outside of his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. And he has overcome. We do not yet see everything in subjection to him because God has saved us in the course of time. And the resurrection is buried in a cave of time. But the fact is, the tomb is empty. The tomb is empty. Jesus was buried in the tomb, and the tomb could not hold him. Jesus has time and time again been buried in history, But history cannot hold him. History cannot conquer him. History will never obliterate him. The resurrection of the Son of God might feel buried by current events. But the gospel that we preach is that Jesus is risen from the dead, never to be buried again. Not by stay-at-home orders, or by restrictions on church attendance, or by economic downturns, or by godless politicians. None of these will keep Christ buried. He will emerge from history as he always does. And one day, all of the kingdoms of this earth will become the kingdoms of our God, and we will be raised with him and live in glory forever and ever. Christ is risen from the dead. Alleluia. Alleluia.